Okay, so we're doing our first video for AP World, AP Euro, and we're talking about how did technology change the nature of World War I? Because technology had a huge role in the reason why this war was so much more devastating than other wars that had been fought in the past. So the first question is, how did the Europeans greet the coming of war? Now you would think a country going to war, we now know and see what the devastating effects of a massive war could be, and you would think that we would be very upset at the prospect of a war coming on. For the Europeans, this was something that was received with happiness. The assumption was that the war was going to be very, very quick. The war started in August. The assumption was that the war was going to be over by Christmas. These countries thought that they were going to get great rewards. It was going to release all the tensions that were building in Europe, and that this would be this, quick, glorious thing. There was this huge surge in patriotism as the different parts of the world began to align against each other, and many, many people ran to join the armies. So here you can see the London version of Uncle Sam. Your country needs you. You need to go off and fight. Then, as far away from Australia, fought on the side of the war, fought on the side of the British. You could see recruits of the Central Power, so German soldiers saying goodbye to his mother, and Austro-Hungarians lining up to join the war. New French recruits traveling. And kind of the attitude was that, or at least the enticement for the men was, because there hadn't been such a major war in Europe since World War I, since the Napoleonic Wars, which ended in 1815, it's kind of like people almost forgot how devastating war can be. And the idea was girls dig guys in uniforms. So, I'm going to go off and be a soldier. I'm going to look really brave and handsome in my uniform. The girls are going to love me. And, this is going to be this quick war, and I'm going to come back this hero, and I'm going to gain all sorts of glory and honor. And that's really what it did not wind up being. As we know, it's one of the most devastating, it is probably one of the most devastating wars ever fought. More people died on the Western Front in the First World War than in the Second World War, actually. So here we could see a boy pretending to be a soldier, trying to enlist women to start helping out for the Navy. The amount of soldiers that were mobilized. So we see these armies of millions upon millions of people, which had really never been done before. Napoleonic Wars was a war where the armies were massive in scale in comparison to anything anyone had ever seen in Europe before. Napoleon's Grand Army was 600,000 men. That's the number of men that will die in a single battle in World War I, if that gives you kind of a perspective of how much bigger the armies became, and that means then how many more people, unfortunately, are available to die in the battles as the war progressed. So the second question is, how did military technology change the war? Now, when the great powers of Europe were kind of gearing up to this war, and everyone, gets themselves into this point of no return, I don't think anyone really truly took into account all the technological advances that had since been made in Europe since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Because when the Napoleonic Wars ended, that was again 1816, 1815, we were just the beginning of industrialization. In 1914, when the World War I starts, you're full on into industrialization. So the weapons are different, the capacity to kill is different, and it completely changes the way that war was fought. Now, as far as the Western Front was essentially in a stalemate. When we talked about that in class, what would happen when the Schieffelin plan kind of didn't work out the way the Germans had hoped it to do. They hoped they could quickly annihilate France, knock them out of the war, and then focus on Russia. That's not what wound up happening. So, basically, what we have is the French army and the German army, which at that point were kind of evenly matched, push up against each other on the Western Front, and neither one can move each other. So they're on these huge open fields, and the only way to create any sort of cover is to dig down and to dig trenches. So they dig these elaborate trenches, which originally started out as just as a basic means of protection. But then as the war went on, they became more and more elaborate. Some of them had electricity, some of them had running water. They had supply trenches. They were these huge, huge complexes. And in between the trenches were what was referred to as no man's land. And that area was riddled with landmines and barbed wire. And if the minute you popped your head up above the trench, there was an enemy soldier on the other end waiting to basically blow your head off with a machine gun or sniper rifles ready to shoot you. So you did not pop your head over, because if you did, essentially it was a death sentence, unless you got the order to go what they called over the top, where you tried to take the other side's trench. But when you tried to do that, you're basically running into machine gun fire. The casualties would be immense. And then if you didn't make it to the other trench, you basically were trapped in this no man's land, because when everyone went back down into their trench, no one's going to pull you out. So if you were injured in battle in no man's land, like entangled in the barbed wire or whatever, shot but not killed, you basically are left there to die. So you would hear back in the as you're back down in the trenches, you would hear the moaning and the dying of the soldiers that were stuck up in no man's land. If you can even try to imagine how horrific that would have been. The other issue with the trenches, which made it really, really difficult, is that these trenches, the northern part of France, where most of these trenches were, has a very high water table. So that means that you dig down a couple of feet, those areas are going to fill up with water. In addition, rain comes down, they fill up with water. So they were very soggy and wet and muddy. The soldiers would get something called trench foot, which is basically where their feet began to rot from being wet all the time. The conditions were horrific within the trenches. Morale was incredibly low, and basically they would say you would have these bouts of just extreme boredom where you're just sitting around, and then all of a sudden you get the call to go over the top, and it would be extreme excitement, life-threatening activities, back down into the trench, just sitting there, waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. So here you can see kind of what life was like in the trench. So the trenches were very difficult. Like I said, it was very difficult to take the other side. You're talking about the hundreds of thousands of men would die for a couple hundred yards to gain ground, because really it basically was just locked in a stalemate. You can see just how elaborate some of these trenches were. And planes were used in World War I, more so for reconnaissance purposes, to spy on the other side, to get an idea of what was going on the other side. But they did mount machine guns to them, or the pilots, because they were open air planes. Think about the old biplanes. They're kind of almost like a convertible airplane. So sometimes they would have machine guns. Sometimes, the pilot himself would be armed with a pistol. Sometimes they would drop bombs. But it wasn't these huge, huge air fights weren't as big of an issue as you're going to see during World War II. Because obviously when you think about it, the huge air fights that occurred during World War II really kind of makes the trenches obsolete, because once you can fly over the trenches and bomb the trenches, then there's really no safety in the trenches. Same thing with tanks, which begin to be used during this time period. But again, they would get sometimes stuck in the mud. They would get stuck in the trenches themselves. They become a much bigger issue in World War II. So the trenches, this is kind of trench warfare in some ways is kind of an older version of fighting. If you look at how wars were fought, say during the American Civil War in the mid-19th century, the soldiers would dig trenches. But you're also talking about there weren't machine guns, there weren't heavy artillery. There were cannons, but they weren't the big Bertha guns like you had during World War I. So this is kind of a war that's being fought in some ways with 19th century methods. Like, for instance, some armies still had mounted cavalry on horses. And then you have, on the flip side, this use of these 20th century warfare, which I think is probably one of the reasons why the numbers were so huge as far as casualties. So if we look at the line, the Western Front, this is kind of a blurry map, but essentially up here, this is the English Channel. So this is France, that's England, so this is the English Channel. So the Western Front essentially went from the English Channel all the way down to the Swiss Alps. This here is Belgium, this is Germany, and like I said, this is France. And so there was just this huge line, and throughout the whole course of the war, it moved maybe, a couple hundred yards this way, and then it moved back a couple hundred yards, but neither side was ever able to actually break through the other side's trenches. But the devastation was just immense that was left as a result of this. And you can see a soldier being shot as trying to go over the top, and just the men that got kind of stuck in the barbed wire that couldn't get out. Here you have one of these French tanks that's set to be used. This is from 1918, this picture. The British tank, but you can see it's kind of like mirrored in the mud and the water. The biplanes, like I said, you could see it's kind of almost like I said, it's almost like a convertible plane. So the guy's kind of sitting right there. So they could, you have, sometimes you would have two-seater planes. You could have one guy piloting and one guy like shooting off the side. And so here you can see in the United States, Curtis Martin aircraft plant. Other weapons that were used for the first time during this time, grenade launchers and flamethrowers. Poison gas. Now, as far as poison gas, this was brought in also to try to deal with the issues of fighting trench warfare. The problem with poison gas, though, you don't ever know if the wind is going to shift, and the poison gas might come back onto your side. They would have to wear gas masks at all times. They even had gas masks for the horses, if you can believe it, because they could also inhale the gas and die. The gas that was used most was called mustard gas, and the reason why it was called mustard gas is because you would get these mustard-colored looking blisters, and if you inhaled it, it was a very painful, miserable death. Other thing that was used in large numbers during this time period for the first time was the machine gun. In the Civil War, like I said, they had something called the Gatling gun, which is like a hand crank gun, which could fire off rapid rounds, but not nearly as fast as what you could have with a machine gun. Grenades. These are these huge, massive, heavy artillery guns. Some of them are called big Bertha guns. And there you can see, there's the big Bertha gun. So they would start hurling these huge ammunition on the other side, and then they would blow the whistle, and they would have to, the soldiers would be expected to run out over the top and try to take the other side's trench. So you could see French women and men working in the factories trying to create all this munitions and other things that they needed, because as you can imagine, all the men were all fighting. Pretty much as the war drags on, the age decreased, the age limit went up and went down. So the soldiers became younger and the soldiers became older as they basically grabbed anybody they could to go off and fight. So you can see German factory workers. So the Germans had the hard time of fighting what was known as a two-front war. And I talked about this the other day, this whole issue of the Schieffelin plan, and how this plan, the goal was to knock out France first, leave Russia open for a time, the idea being it would take Russia longer to mobilize, and then this would allow them to, Germany, to avoid fighting this two-front war, which is something that the Germans had really feared. The problem was Schieffelin dies, the new general who takes over for the German forces, I'm not spelling him right. Yes, I am. He was the guy that took over. He was kind of nervous about leaving the Eastern Front completely open, transferred some troops over there. Doing that weakened the German forces and then allowed the French to be able to stand up to them. What this also did is, because the Germans went through neutral Belgium to get to France, this had the problem of bringing Britain into the war. So the Germans had to do exactly what they had feared the most, which was fight a multi-front war. So basically, during the course of this war, the Russians, because the Russians were kind of fighting all on their own, they didn't have the benefit of having Britain being able to resupply them, or eventually the U.S. The Russians here had some of the largest casualties in the war. And some of the major battles of Somme, battles of Verdun, Marne, like the loss of life in some of these battles is completely astronomical. For instance, the Battle of Verdun, which started in 1916, in which the Germans were trying to break the deadlock. The Germans attacked in February of 1916, while the French were preparing the offensive on the Battle of the Somme. Basically, it lasted 6 months, and we're talking as many losses, 330 to 350,000 people died. Other major battle, the Battle of the Somme, where the Allies launched an offensive. where we have large amounts of artillery, and the British were able to break through the German line. It lasted from July to October. The Germans lost 500,000 men, the British 400,000, and the French 200,000. So this basically, they weren't getting themselves anywhere. Another major battle was called the Battle of Gallipoli. So you see here, this is Gallipoli, which was in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were fighting on the side of the Germans. And what the goal was for the Allies was to take these guns that were here in Gallipoli, because this is the Dardanelles Strait, which is a very narrow waterway, so the Ottomans had guns trained on that area. So what the British wanted to do and the Allies wanted to do was take those guns so they can get through into the Black Sea and resupply Russia, who was kind of left fighting on their own. That battle was a massive disaster, and I'll talk about that one in a second. So you could just see this is a map of the Western Front. You could see the lines move a little bit, but never very far. So this is the Battle of Gallipoli. So this is the Dardanelles Straits that I pointed out to you in the other slide. And they wanted to take, because like I said, they had guns pointed, the Ottomans had guns pointed on either side, so you couldn't get any troops in. Now the issue with Gallipoli, and this is actually a picture I took while I was in Gallipoli, is you land on the beach, and then the land slopes up dramatically, and all the Ottomans are, like, at the top here, shooting down, while you're trying to march up with your 60-pound pack. This is not going to work out well for the Allied troops at all. So essentially it wound up being almost like a suicide mission. So you can see this is the trenches that were at the top, pointed down the slope at the Allies trying to come up. And you can kind of see just how steep the slope is at the top. And this is a really bad picture of myself when I was there at Gallipoli. Another picture of myself at Gallipoli. What's interesting about Gallipoli, most of the people who died in Gallipoli were Australians and New Zealanders. And so this battle has like a huge significance in the history of Australia and New Zealand. ASNAC Day, which is Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, which commemorates the Battle of Gallipoli, is like a huge, huge holiday to this day in Australia. So the Battle of Verdun, like I said, was a German offensive in 1916, which did not go well. The Battle of Somme was in July of 1916. You have 60,000 British soldiers killed in one day. And so you can just see some of the effects. So people coming back from war were maimed, were, injured beyond belief. A lot of people lost limbs. And the other thing about the war was both sides, there really wasn't any true hatred between the French and the British. It was all like rivalries, but the soldiers themselves had a lot in common with each other. They would kind of talk back and forth to each other across the trenches, and so there had to be a huge propaganda campaign to make the other side hate each other, so they can kind of get the troops to fight, because that was actually a major problem. That sometimes the troops just, as the war dragged on, didn't really want to fight. The war also had to be financed, so they were trying to sell bonds. So you could see the women being asked to go back to work, to go to work in the factories and to work in the fields to support the war effort. There's a woman ambulance driver, Red Cross nurses who also helped out, the women in the army's artillery. In Russia, you even had women fight themselves in the war. So you could see kind of like, this kind of spiky thing on the top of the head, that's typical of the German army uniform. So here you can see them kind of like demonizing him, making him seem like this like villain that was going to take over everything. Kind of almost like King Kong. You just see some of the propaganda that was used. This is the German poster. But that hat is very similar. Some very common things the French would wear. Now, because this was a world war, other parts of the world were involved in it. So you could see Lawrence of Arabia, who was a British soldier who went to kind of make deals with the Arabs and trying to get the Arabs on their side to fight against the Turks, who were the Ottomans. So the Middle East, which is like places like Saudi Arabia, were inhabited by Arabs, and they were under the control of the Ottoman Empire, which are Turks. So they were trying to make promises to the Arabs to get them to fight against the Turks. Here we can see these are Sikh British soldiers in India, because the Indians were promised greater autonomy or self-rule if they helped the British fight, and about 1 million Indians fought in World War I. There was also fighting in the colonies. The German colonies and the British colonies and the French colonies were also targets of fighting during the war itself. So this is the Nigerian brigade. This is fighting in Greece. So the French also at this point controlled parts of China, what's referred to as Indochina, which today is Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So they got soldiers from those colonies and had them fight in Greece. Here you can see the Turkish cavalry in Pakistan. And from there I'm going to stop, because I promised I would keep this short, and I'm sure Miranda's already mad at me. But so I'm going to stop here. I'll finish up talking about some of the things I wanted to finish talking about in class. Saturday night.